The quiet gift that changed everything. Lowe's angels had a way of pretending it never slept, yet there were nights when even the city seemed to breathe more softly, as if giving space to the people who carried too much inside their hearts. On one of those nights, the lights beyond the glass walls of a quiet hillside home glimmered like distant stars, blurred and gentle, no longer demanding attention. Inside, Sandra Bullock sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her back resting against the couch, her palms moving slowly through the warm, familiar fur of the dog curled beside her. The dog was older now. Her movements were slower, her breaths more deliberate, as if every inhale and exhale required a quiet decision. She rested her head on Sandra's knee, eyes half closed, trusting, present, and deeply calm. For years, she had been more than a pet. She had been a witness, a companion through silence, through laughter, through moments when applause faded and the world went quiet again. Tonight, Sandra wasn't thinking about premieres or scripts or interviews. She was thinking about time, how gently it slips away when you're not watching, and how loudly it announces itself when you finally do. The veterinarian's words from earlier that day replayed in her mind, not as a sentence but as a feeling, one that sat heavy in her chest. Nothing dramatic, no sudden alarms, just the quiet truth that age eventually asks for patience, care, and acceptance. Sandra had nodded at the clinic, steady and composed, the way people expected her to be. But now, alone in her home, she let the silence speak. She leaned down and pressed her forehead lightly against the dog's, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure were meant for the dog or herself. "You're okay," she murmured. "I'm right here." The dog's tail moved slightly, a soft thump against the rug as if answering. It was close to midnight when the knock came. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 gentle taps against the door, respectful and unassuming. Sandra froze for a moment, her instincts flickering between caution and curiosity. No one came unannounced this late, not anymore. She carefully stood, steadying herself against the wall, and glanced toward the security monitor. The porch camera revealed a familiar figure standing under the warm porch light, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket, posture relaxed, eyes calm. She opened the door slowly. "Hey," Keanu Reeves said, his voice soft, as if matching the mood of the night. He held a small paper bag in one hand, the kind you'd find at a local craft shop or bakery. No assistants. No entourage, just him. Sandra blinked, surprised. "Keanu, it's late." "I know," he replied gently. "I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important. May I?" She stepped aside without thinking, the familiar comfort of his presence settling in the room like a warm blanket. Keanu had always carried himself this way, never entering a space as if he owned it, but as if he was grateful to be allowed inside. He noticed the dim lighting, the dog on the rug, the half-finished cup of tea on the table. He noticed everything quietly. "I heard she hasn't been feeling well," he said, nodding toward the dog as he knelt down a few steps away, careful not to startle her. Sandra's eyebrows lifted. "I didn't tell anyone." "You didn't have to," he said with a faint smile. "Someone at the shelter mentioned it. They remembered her, said she was adopted years ago by someone who never gave up on her." Sandra felt her throat tighten. "That sounds like her." Keanu placed the paper bag on the coffee table but didn't open it yet. Instead, he reached out slowly, letting the dog sniff his hand before gently resting his fingers on her fur. His touch was careful, practiced, as if he understood the fragile language of aging animals, how presence mattered more than energy, how gentleness spoke louder than excitement. "She's strong," he said. "You can see it in her eyes." Sandra nodded, lowering herself back onto the floor. "She always has been. She carried me through some of the hardest years of my life. I just didn't realize how much until now." Keanu didn't respond right away. Silence with him was never empty. It was intentional, thoughtful, and safe. After a moment, he reached for the bag and carefully pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a hand-carved wooden charm, simple, imperfect in the way only handmade things could be, shaped like a small heart. Sandra leaned closer. Engraved on the surface were 4 quiet words. "Thank you for staying." Below them, smaller and almost shyly carved, was the dog's name. "I made it," Keanu said, almost apologetically. "I'm not an expert, but I thought maybe she should have something that says what matters." Sandra stared at the charm, her eyes filling before she could stop it. "You did this for her." "For both of you," he replied. "Sometimes love deserves to be acknowledged, especially the quiet kind." She reached out, her fingers brushing over the wood, feeling the grooves where his hands had pressed a blade again and again, shaping gratitude into something tangible. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her expression said everything. Keanu smiled, small and sincere. "I didn't come to fix anything," he added. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone in this." The dog shifted slightly, lifting her head just enough for Sandra to slip the charm onto her collar. It rested there perfectly, catching the light as if it had always belonged. The dog's tail moved again, stronger this time. Sandra laughed softly through her tears. "She likes it." "Of course she does," Keanu said. "She understands more than we think." They sat together on the floor for a long time after that. No speeches, no plans, just presence. The city hummed beyond the walls, unaware that something important had just happened inside a quiet room, something small, human, and deeply real. As Keanu stood to leave, he paused at the door. "There's a place," he said carefully. "A lake a few hours north, quiet, peaceful. If she ever feels up to it, it might be good for her, for both of you." Sandra looked back at the dog, then at the charm, then at him. "I think she'd like that." "So would I," he replied. The door closed softly behind him, and Sandra sat back down on the floor, her hand resting over the small wooden heart. Outside, the city lights flickered on, but inside, something warmer had begun. A reminder that kindness doesn't always arrive loudly, and that the smallest gifts often carry the deepest meaning. And this was only the beginning. The road where silence begins to heal. The morning Sandra Bullock finally agreed to leave the city did not arrive with drama or certainty, but with a quiet resolve that settled into her bones as naturally as breathing. Los Angeles stretched outside her bedroom window in its usual confident way, sunlight sliding across glass and concrete, traffic already humming with urgency. Yet inside her home time moved differently, slower, almost respectfully, as if the walls themselves understood that something fragile was being carried forward. Her dog lay near the doorway, awake but resting, eyes following Sandra's movements with the calm devotion that only comes from years of shared routines and unspoken understanding. And when Sandra knelt to fasten the leash and gently adjust the small wooden heart on her collar, she felt a strange mixture of fear and gratitude rise together in her chest, because leaving felt like hope, and hope felt dangerous when you loved something this deeply. She heard the motorcycle before she saw it, the sound steady and familiar rather than intrusive. And when she stepped outside, she found Keanu Reeves already waiting at the curb, helmet tucked under one arm, dressed simply, almost invisibly, as if he had learned long ago that the loudest presence was often the least necessary. Attached behind the motorcycle was the small trailer he had mentioned, carefully built, padded and secure, with blankets folded neatly inside, every detail quietly thought through. Sandra smiled despite herself, because there was something profoundly comforting about someone who prepared without asking for credit. And as Keanu helped her guide the dog gently into the basket, speaking in soft, reassuring tones meant more for comfort than instruction, she realized that this journey had already begun long before the engine turned over. The road out of the city unfolded gradually, concrete giving way to hills, noise dissolving into wind, and with every mile Sandra felt the weight she carried loosen just enough to breathe more freely. She rode behind Keanu in silence, arms wrapped around herself, watching the world blur and sharpen again in waves of green and gold, pine trees replacing billboards, sky widening until it felt like something you could finally lean into. There were no conversations through headsets, no music competing with thought, just the steady rhythm of travel and the quiet presence of someone who did not demand explanation. And that, more than anything, allowed Sandra to sit with her thoughts without being overwhelmed by them, to feel the ache of uncertainty without being consumed by it. When they stopped briefly at a small roadside cafe, the kind that existed for travelers rather than tourists, Keanu ordered tea for both of them without asking, remembering a detail she hadn't even realized she had shared. And they sat at a worn wooden table near the window, watching trucks pass and birds hop along the edge of the parking lot, while the dog rested nearby, alert but content, her tail moving slowly whenever Sandra's foot brushed against her. It was there, between sips of warm tea and the faint smell of pine drifting through the open door, that Sandra felt the first real shift inside herself, the subtle realization that grief did not always announce itself as sorrow, but sometimes arrived disguised as exhaustion, as the quiet relief of not having to pretend you were stronger than you felt. They reached the lake by late afternoon, the water stretching out like a held breath between the mountains, reflecting clouds that moved lazily across a sky untouched by city haze. And as Sandra stepped off the bike and helped her dog down, she watched the way the animal paused, nose lifted, eyes brightening as if recognizing something ancient and familiar in the air. The dog walked toward the water slowly, deliberately, paws touching the edge with reverence rather than excitement. And Sandra felt tears gather, not from fear this time, but from awe, because in that simple moment she saw resilience without struggle, presence without denial, and it humbled her more than any role she had ever played. Keanu sat beside her on the dock without speaking, handing her a thermos, and the warmth seeped into her hands as naturally as the quiet seeped into her heart. And when she finally spoke, it was not to explain or confess, but simply to acknowledge what she felt, telling him that moments like this were the ones people never saw, the ones that mattered far more than applause, because they were real and unrepeatable. He nodded, gaze fixed on the rippling water, and told her gently that stillness was not emptiness, that sometimes it was the space where healing began, where memories could exist without pain demanding control. As the sun dipped lower and the lake shifted into deeper shades of blue and gold, Sandra noticed the way Keanu's expression changed, how his eyes carried something distant, something heavy, and though she did not press him, she sensed that this place held his own quiet history, chapters written in silence rather than headlines. When he finally spoke of his old dog, of how this lake had once been a refuge during years he rarely talked about, Sandra understood without needing details, because grief recognized grief and love recognized love, regardless of form. She reached out, resting her hand over his, not to comfort him away from his memories, but to sit with them, and in that shared stillness something unspoken settled between them, a trust built not on words but on mutual understanding. They stayed until the light faded and the air cooled, watching the dog lie beside them, the small wooden charm catching the last rays of sunlight like a quiet promise. And Sandra realized then that this journey was not about escaping loss or delaying the inevitable, but about honoring what remained, about choosing presence over fear and kindness over denial. When night finally settled around the lake and stars appeared one by one, Sandra felt a calm she had not known in weeks, a calm born not from certainty but from connection. And as she wrapped a blanket around her dog and looked out at the water, she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it not alone, but grounded in the simple, powerful truth that love, when given fully, never truly disappears. It only finds new ways to stay. The night that spoke without words. Night arrived at the lake with a gentleness that felt intentional, as though the world itself understood the weight of the moment and chose not to rush it. The sky darkened slowly, layers of blue fading into deep indigo, stars emerging one by one like quiet witnesses, and the air cooled just enough to remind Sandra Bullock that she was far from the city now, far from schedules and expectations, standing in a place where nothing asked her to be anything other than present. The small cabin near the shoreline glowed softly from within, warm light spilling onto the wooden deck, and inside, the crackle of a fire replaced the distant hum of traffic she had grown used to ignoring. Her dog lay near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, breathing steadily, her eyes half open and peaceful. And as Sandra watched her chest rise and fall, she felt a familiar ache tighten around her heart, the kind that comes when love and fear exist side by side with no clear boundary between them. Across the room, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, tending to the fire with deliberate care, each movement unhurried, almost meditative, as if he understood that tonight required patience rather than distraction. He didn't fill the silence with conversation, and Sandra was grateful for that because the quiet felt full rather than empty, heavy with thoughts that needed space to settle. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to steer the moment, but to acknowledge it, mentioning softly how nights like this always seemed louder than days, not because of noise, but because there was nothing left to hide behind once the world grew still. Sandra nodded, understanding immediately because she had felt the same thing countless times after the lights dimmed and applause faded, when the quiet reminded her of everything she had been too busy to feel. They ate a simple dinner together, plates balanced on their knees, firelight dancing across the wooden walls, and the conversation drifted naturally, touching on memories rather than plans, on moments rather than milestones. Sandra spoke about the early days of her career, about how overwhelming it had been to suddenly be seen by everyone while feeling understood by almost no one, and how her dog had been the one constant presence through every move, every hotel room, every moment of doubt she never shared publicly. Keanu listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, not offering solutions or commentary, just holding the space for her words to exist. And when she finished, he nodded slowly, telling her that animals had a way of grounding people when the world pulled too hard in every other direction, because they didn't care who you were outside, only how you showed up when it mattered. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened, the wind outside picked up slightly, rustling the trees, and Sandra felt a strange vulnerability settle in, the kind that comes when exhaustion lowers the walls you didn't realize you had built. She admitted quietly that she was scared, not just of losing her dog, but of what that loss represented, of the reminder that nothing, no matter how loyal or loving, was permanent. Keanu didn't rush to respond, and when he did, his voice was low and steady, telling her that fear was not a weakness but evidence of love, that the depth of grief was always equal to the depth of connection, and that trying to avoid one only diminished the other. His words didn't erase her fear, but they reframed it, transforming it from something she needed to fight into something she could carry with honesty. Later, when the power briefly flickered and the cabin fell into near darkness, lit only by the fire and a few candles Keanu had set out earlier, Sandra felt the moment stretch, the shadows growing longer, the silence deeper. Her dog stirred, letting out a soft whine, and Sandra moved instinctively to her side, whispering reassurance, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. Keanu knelt beside them, placing his hand gently over the dog's paw, his touch calm and grounding. And in that shared moment, Sandra realized how rare it was to find someone who understood how to be present during uncertainty without trying to control it. The storm outside intensified briefly, rain tapping against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance, and Sandra confessed through quiet tears that she didn't know how she would face the morning if this night ended differently than she hoped. Keanu listened, then shared something he rarely spoke about, not with drama or emphasis, but with simple honesty, explaining that years earlier, during a period of profound loss, his own dog had been the reason he kept moving forward, the silent companion who asked nothing but offered everything, reminding him daily that love didn't require answers to be real. Sandra felt the weight of his words settle into her, not as a story meant to impress, but as a truth offered carefully, and in that moment she understood that this trip had never been just about helping her dog feel peace, but about two people acknowledging the quiet grief they both carried and allowing it to exist without judgment. As the storm passed and the night softened again, the cabin grew quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and Sandra sat on the floor with her dog's head resting in her lap, brushing her fur slowly, memorizing the texture, the warmth, the simple miracle of presence. Keanu sat nearby, not intruding, not retreating, simply there, and Sandra felt a deep sense of gratitude rise within her, not because the future felt certain, but because this moment felt honest. When she finally whispered her dog's name, thanking her for staying, for choosing loyalty every single day, the words felt heavier and more meaningful than she had expected, as if saying them out loud transformed gratitude into something permanent. That night, as Sandra lay awake listening to the gentle rhythm of breathing beside her and the faint sounds of the lake beyond the cabin walls, she understood something that would stay with her long after this journey ended. That love was not measured by how long it lasted, but by how fully it was given while it was there, and that kindness, especially the quiet kind, did not fade when circumstances changed. Somewhere in the darkness, the small wooden charm on her dog's collar caught a flicker of firelight and glowed briefly, like a heartbeat, and Sandra closed her eyes knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, this night had already changed her in ways she could never fully explain, only feel. The morning that redefined goodbye. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency or alarm, but with a pale ribbon of light sliding across the cabin floor, touching the edges of furniture and lingering gently on the familiar curve of a resting form. Sandra woke before she meant to, her senses alert before her thoughts caught up, and for a brief, fragile moment she lay still, listening, counting breaths the way love teaches you to do when time feels uncertain. The lake outside was calm, its surface smooth and reflective, mist hovering low as if the night had not entirely let go. And inside the cabin the air felt different, heavier yet strangely peaceful, carrying that unmistakable stillness that settles only after something profound has shifted. She turned her head slowly, heart tightening, and saw her dog lying beside her, wrapped in blankets, her expression serene, her body warm but unmoving, and in that instant Sandra understood without needing confirmation that this morning had arrived carrying an ending. She did not cry out. She did not panic. Instead, she reached out with trembling hands and rested her forehead against the soft fur she had known for so many years, whispering words of gratitude that came instinctively, as natural as breathing, thanking her for staying, for loving without conditions, for being present in every season of her life when the world demanded more than she could give. The silence in the room felt sacred rather than cruel, as if the space itself respected the depth of the moment, and when Keanu appeared quietly at the doorway, already awake, already understanding, he did not intrude with questions or comfort meant to distract. He simply knelt beside her and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, offering presence instead of reassurance, allowing grief to exist without interruption. Together they moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had softened its grip, carrying the dog outside to the lake's edge where the light had grown warmer and the mist was beginning to lift. The willow tree near the shore swayed gently, its long branches brushing the water as if in greeting, and Sandra felt a strange sense of rightness settle in her chest, a quiet acceptance that this place, chosen not by chance but by care, would hold the memory of a love that had never asked for recognition. She placed the small wooden charm against her dog's collar one last time, her fingers tracing the carved words as if committing them to memory, and then laid her down with reverence, her voice steady even as tears fell freely, because grief did not feel like chaos in that moment, but like devotion taking a new form. They stayed there longer than either could measure, not watching the clock, not speaking unless words felt necessary, and when Sandra finally sat back on the dock, exhaustion washing over her in quiet waves, she realized that what she felt was not emptiness, but fullness, the kind that follows deep connection, the kind that hurts because it mattered. Keanu sat beside her without crowding, gazing out at the water and spoke softly about how love never truly ends, how it simply changes its address, moving from presence into memory, from touch into meaning. And Sandra listened, not because she needed guidance, but because his words reflected something she was already beginning to understand. The lake shimmered as the sun rose higher, birds calling softly from the trees, life continuing not in disregard of loss, but alongside it, and Sandra felt something loosen inside her, a release that came not from letting go, but from allowing love to remain without fear. Later, back inside the cabin, Sandra found herself opening a notebook she had carried for years, pages filled with thoughts she had never meant to share. And without planning to, she began to write, not about loss, but about gratitude, about the way small acts of kindness often hold more power than grand gestures, about how being present can heal wounds that applause never touches. She wrote about loyalty, about patience, about the kind of love that waits quietly until you are ready to notice it. And as the words flowed, she realized that this experience, painful as it was, had given her clarity she had been searching for without knowing it. She no longer felt the need to outrun grief or hide it behind strength. She felt called to honor it, to transform it into something that could offer comfort to others who loved deeply and lost quietly. When she finally stepped outside again, the sun had fully risen, painting the lake in gold, and Keanu was there, standing near the water, skipping small stones across the surface with thoughtful precision. She joined him without speaking, and for a long moment they watched the ripples fade, each one spreading outward before disappearing, leaving the water calm once more. Sandra understood then that grief moved the same way, beginning sharp and defined, then gradually softening, not because it vanished, but because it became part of the larger whole. She turned to him and said quietly that she wanted to do something meaningful, something lasting, not to escape the pain, but to give it purpose. And when he nodded, already supportive without asking for details, she felt a renewed sense of strength rise within her, not the kind that demands resilience, but the kind that grows from acceptance. As they prepared to leave the lake later that day, Sandra took one last look at the place that had held both hope and farewell, and instead of feeling broken, she felt grounded, aware that love had not been taken from her, only transformed. She understood now that endings, when met with kindness, could become beginnings in disguise, and that the quiet gift that had brought her here had done far more than offer comfort. It had shown her how to stand still long enough to feel what mattered. With that realization settling gently into her heart, Sandra stepped forward, ready to carry what she had learned back into the world, not as a burden, but as a promise, knowing that the story unfolding from this moment onward would be shaped not by loss alone, but by the enduring power of love that chooses to stay, even when its form changes forever. When grief learned how to become purpose, returning to Los Angeles felt different this time, not because the city had changed, but because Sandra Bullock had. The familiar skyline greeted her with its usual confidence, sunlight bouncing off glass towers and busy streets humming with urgency, yet she moved through it with a quieter strength, one born not from distraction or momentum, but from acceptance. Her home, once filled with routines shaped around another heartbeat, now held a gentler stillness, and though the absence pressed against her chest when she crossed the threshold, it did not crush her. Instead, it reminded her of everything that had been given freely and completely. The small wooden charm rested on her palm as she set down her bag, its surface smooth from touch. The words carved into it no longer a message of gratitude alone, but a reminder of responsibility. The responsibility to honor love by allowing it to continue its work in the world. In the days that followed, Sandra found herself waking early, not from restlessness but from clarity. Ideas formed not as grand plans, but as quiet certainties, each one rooted in the memory of loyalty and patience she had witnessed up close. She thought about the animals she had seen at shelters over the years, the older ones whose eyes carried stories but rarely caught attention, the ones people passed by in favor of youth and promise. She realized then that grief had sharpened her vision, allowing her to see what had always been there but rarely acknowledged. Love did not end when companionship did. It waited for direction, for a new place to belong, and Sandra knew where she wanted to give it a home. She reached out to Keanu Reeves quietly, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a simple message asking if he would join her for coffee. When they met at a small, unassuming cafe tucked away from crowds and cameras, she told him about her idea with careful honesty, explaining that she wanted to create a space dedicated to older animals, a place where they could live out their remaining years with dignity, comfort, and care, without pressure to perform or impress. She spoke about how grief had taught her that presence mattered more than time, and how kindness, when given intentionally, could reshape loss into meaning. Keanu listened with the same calm attentiveness she had come to recognize, nodding slowly, his eyes reflecting understanding rather than surprise. And when she finished, he smiled softly and told her that purpose born from love always carried the strongest foundation. The project began modestly, not as a headline, but as a commitment. Sandra invested her time as deeply as her resources, visiting facilities, speaking with caregivers, learning the quiet details of what aging animals truly needed, and every step she took felt guided by memory rather than obligation. She insisted on simplicity, on spaces filled with light, warmth, and calm, on routines built around patience rather than efficiency, because she understood now that healing did not thrive under urgency. Keanu supported her quietly, offering help without stepping into the spotlight, connecting her with people who shared the same values, contributing not for recognition, but because it mattered. Their collaboration felt effortless, shaped by mutual respect, and a shared understanding that kindness did its best work when it wasn't performing for approval. As word slowly spread, something unexpected happened. People listened, not because of celebrity, but because of sincerity. Letters arrived from individuals who had loved and lost their own companions, who recognized themselves in the story not as spectators, but as participants. Volunteers offered time. Donors offered support. Most importantly, animals arrived, older dogs and cats with cloudy eyes and cautious steps, each carrying a history of devotion that had never asked for reward. Sandra walked among them often, kneeling, sitting, allowing them to approach her on their terms, and in every gentle interaction she felt the presence of what she had lost not as pain, but as guidance. There were moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, catching her off guard during quiet evenings or familiar routines, but instead of resisting it, Sandra learned to let it pass through her, understanding now that sorrow did not erase progress, nor did it diminish purpose. It simply reminded her why the work mattered. On one such evening, as she sat alone on her porch watching the sky darken, she held the wooden charm again, its weight familiar and grounding, and realized that love, once given fully, never truly left. It simply asked to be carried forward with intention. When the shelter finally opened its doors, there was no red carpet, no spectacle, just a gathering of people united by empathy and a shared belief that every life deserved gentleness, especially near its end. Sandra stood quietly among them, not as a figure to be admired, but as someone who understood what it meant to love without guarantees. Keanu watched from a short distance, content to remain unseen, and when their eyes met briefly, there was no need for words. They both knew that what had begun as a simple gift had grown into something far larger, something that would continue long after attention faded. As night settled and the shelter grew quiet, Sandra walked through the halls one last time, listening to the soft breathing of animals resting peacefully, and she felt a sense of completion she had not expected. Grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed, reshaped into a force that created rather than consumed. Standing there, she understood that purpose was not something found through success or recognition, but through the willingness to let love guide you even when it hurts. And with that understanding, she knew that the journey she had begun at the lake was nearing its final chapter, not as an ending, but as a promise, one that would continue to echo in every life touched by the kindness that chose, again and again, to stay. The kindness that learned how to stay. The months that followed unfolded without spectacle, shaped instead by the steady rhythm of days lived with intention. And Sandra Bullock came to understand that this was what real healing looked like. Not a dramatic turning point, but a quiet consistency that asked her to show up again and again with patience rather than certainty. The shelter had found its own heartbeat now, mornings beginning with soft light filtering through wide windows and the gentle sounds of movement as older animals stirred, stretching stiff legs and blinking into a world that no longer demanded speed or performance. Sandra moved through the space with ease, greeting each familiar face with the kind of attentiveness that could not be taught, because it had been earned through love and loss, and every time she knelt to meet an animal at eye level, she felt the presence of what had guided her here, not as grief, but as wisdom that knew how to recognize devotion when it appeared quietly. There were afternoons when she sat on the grass beside dogs who preferred simply to be near someone rather than entertained, moments when stillness felt like a shared language rather than an absence. And in those moments, she noticed how often people misunderstood healing as forgetting, when in truth it was remembering without fear. Visitors would sometimes ask how she managed to do this work without reopening old wounds, and Sandra would smile gently, explaining that wounds healed best when they were allowed to breathe, when love was given a new place to live instead of being locked away. The shelter walls held photographs now, not posed or polished, but honest, images of animals resting peacefully, of volunteers reading quietly beside them, of small hands learning early that care did not always need an audience. Through it all, Keanu Reeves remained present in the same way he always had, never arriving with announcements, never leaving behind expectations, simply contributing time, resources, and calm when it was needed most. He spent hours repairing benches, planting trees along the edges of the property, and sitting with animals who preferred silence to stimulation, understanding instinctively that comfort often came from being seen rather than fixed. Sandra watched him from a distance more than once, recognizing in his quiet consistency the same lesson she had learned the hard way. That kindness did not need to be loud to be transformative, and that the most meaningful connections often formed when no one was trying to impress anyone else. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shelter grew still, Sandra found herself standing beneath a young willow planted near the far fence, its branches beginning to reach outward, and she felt a sense of completion settle in her chest, not because her grief had vanished, but because it no longer defined her. She thought about how loss had once felt like an ending she could not outrun, and how now it felt like a beginning she had been invited to shape. And in that realization she understood that love, when honored honestly, did not disappear. It multiplied, spreading quietly into places that needed it most. She rested her hand against the small wooden charm she carried in her pocket, worn smooth with time, and felt gratitude rise not as a wave, but as a steady presence that did not require expression to be real. On the shelter's first anniversary, there was no ceremony, no speeches, just an open day where people came to walk, sit, and learn what gentleness looked like when it was practiced daily rather than promised occasionally. Sandra stood among them without needing to lead, listening as others shared their own stories of companionship and goodbye, and she recognized the familiar shape of healing taking place not through answers, but through shared understanding. When someone asked her what had inspired all of this, she did not speak of pain or loss, but of loyalty, of patience, of a love that stayed without asking to be noticed, because she knew now that the most powerful stories were not the ones that demanded attention, but the ones that quietly changed how people chose to care. As dusk settled and the last visitors drifted away, Sandra and Keanu stood together near the fence, watching the shelter lights glow softly against the darkening sky. And though neither felt the need to speak, there was a shared recognition between them that this chapter, painful and beautiful in equal measure, had taught them something enduring. They had learned that kindness was not a moment, but a practice, not a reaction, but a choice made daily, and that when love was allowed to guide action rather than memory alone, it became something resilient, something capable of shaping the future without denying the past. When Sandra finally returned home that night, she did not feel the emptiness she once feared would follow her forever. Instead, she felt connected, to the animals resting peacefully, to the people who had learned to slow down, to the quiet truth that love did not end when presence changed. She placed the wooden charm on her bedside table, not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder of responsibility, a promise to continue choosing compassion even when it was inconvenient, even when no one was watching. And as she turned out the light and lay down, she realized that the sweetest gift she had received was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared, carried forward in small, steady acts of care that would continue long after stories faded. Somewhere beyond the city, the lake remained still. The willow branches swayed gently in the night air, and kindness, once given freely, continued to live on, not as memory alone, but as purpose that chose, every single day, to stay.